Hello, my name is Joey Grable, and today I'm going to be walking you through the inspiration, the development, and some applications of the first font that I'm publishing. It's called Concourse. So again, starting out with some inspiration. I was walking downtown Seattle one time in the wintertime, February 26th, and I came across the Union Station, which is just between the International District and the Pioneer Square District. And I've heard of the building from friends who work in transportation, but I had never been inside, so I walked in and immediately I was taken back by the contrast from the lofted arch along the entire length of the building compared to the brutal brick exterior. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed intricate details carved onto the wall, the ironwork on lamps. And when I reached the end of the south wall, looking up below the clock, there was a sign above the doors that said, "To Concourse." And I thought, it looked hand-painted, so it would be an interesting concept to revive a hand-painted sign into the digital era. So first I started with designing the initial character set. And in general, my process goes sketching, then digitizing, then building the entire character set, then adding spacing, and kerning to the font. Then last is testing the font, so putting it in use cases, using some pangram strings, and we'll walk through this. But in the first phase, it's all about sketching. And in this phase, for me, it was about studying the forms that I was given. The original To Concourse sign had 8 unique glyphs, T-O-C-N, U, R, S, and E. So I only had 8 characters. There was a good set of rounded characters and some more vertical characters, but no, one diagonal at the end. So the first sketching phase is about learning what the shapes of the font, what characteristics I want to have built into the font. And this is by closely studying what the sign looked like and trying to invent other characters that aren't there, and envisioning how those would be shaped if they shared the properties of the original characters. And it's a lot of sketching, different styles, different sizes helps too. I like to use a Prismacolor. Right here, I like to use the Prismacolor Ebony Jet Black Extra Smooth. This is my pencil of choice. It's very soft, but if you put a lot of pressure on it, you can get some really darks out of it. So it's actually a perfect tool for this, the method that I use, which is called the Norgetz method, invented by Garrett Norgetz, who was type calligraphy philosopher, is honestly how I'd classify him. He's a thinker about letters, and he produced a book, and one of his methods is where you sketch, just use rough hatch marks to get a rough outline of the general shape, and then once you kind of have a good form, you'll go back in with a sharper or more pressure and start defining the physical boundaries between the positive space of the letter and the negative space on the outside and on the counter on the inside of the letter. And so as I was sketching, some things that I was keeping in mind on how I wanted what characteristics I wanted to apply to the other letters, I was really paying attention to the different stems, so vertical stems in the I here, round stems like O, and diagonal stems on a character like a V. Also, I was paying attention to the sharpness of the original characters and hadn't yet settled on, but knew I had to figure out how tall I wanted the serifs. If you look carefully, the serifs are actually flat on the end. They don't go to a perfect point like the original sign does. And this is for optical properties to make the font more readable, but I was very careful to make them sharp enough that it would retain the nice point. Another thing I was thinking about was the ratios between all the different metrics. So on my first version, I made the X height too high, so after testing, I reduced the X height a little bit and settled on this version. But paying attention on how that relates to the cap height, how it relates to ascenders and descenders. And then other more minute details like what direction characters like the A or the V are facing. Like, for example, the V is thinner on its left side, our right side, and it's thicker on the opposite. And this makes it appear like it's facing on our right-hand direction. And so you see fonts that have different characteristics like that. And that helps build contrast into your font. A little note on type design. I'm not going to go into details about the digitize, like the actual digital process of making points, but I want to show here what a outline of a letter looks like. You have these nodes, which are the green or the blue points. Green means they're smooth point curves, and blue means they're hard points, so they can angled. Uh, and the handles that go off the side are called Tooney lines, invented by a man named Eduardo Tooney. That's just to represent the shape, the speed, or the math that defines that shape. So those handles control the curvature of the letter, so to speak. So this is what the Q looked like, capital. This was one of my most difficult characters designing, so I wanted to show it here with the final form look, and how the counter is, and how the Q tail dips between the bottom, and its relation to the lowercase q as well. Now when I started moving from the digital, or from the sketch process into the digitization process, digital process, typically when I'm sketching key characters, like characters that I really want to stand out, the characters that really make the font feel like its own font, feel like Concourse. So these were the key characters that I was paying attention to for the capitals, the majuscules, and the minuscules. So the A on both sides, the K definitely for both upper and lower, W as well, S, G. But then there's some ones that are just the lowercase y. I wanted to add a little jolly on it to contrast with the sharpness of the capital Y. And this is shown here. The capital S has a sharp serifs on both ends, but then this lowercase s has these little ball terminals. So there's contrast between the majuscule letters and the minuscule letters. So I was thinking, keeping that in mind, the contrast of the font. Now, after I sketched the key characters and really decided on those characteristics of the elements of those characters that I want to apply to the entire font, then I went through essentially as a typographic ductus, which is an order of doing things essentially. And so there's sort of a standard practice in type design where you develop the fonts digitally in an order that are relative to each other. So for example, these are organized by their letter groups. You got the I, or the vertical letter groups on the top, starting with I, and curved with O, the kind of half unique ones, BRP, and then the JUYKS are unique characters for the capitals, and the bottom are diagonal emphasized characters. And then you can see a similar breakdown on the right-hand side of how I chose to digitize the sketches on the lowercase forms. And I did them in this order. So starting with the I, H, L, use the bottom of the L to flip it, create the top of the E, adjust, cut off the bottom of the E, create the F, mirror the top of the E on both sides to make the T. Little things like that. You can reuse components of your font when you know the characteristics, have defined what the contrast is supposed to look like, and you have an order that you're creating the characters. It helps build consistency into your font design. And so after I designed the 26 majuscules, 26 minuscules, so 52 characters total, then goes into building the entire font character set. So people often forget that there are other characters that come in fonts. At least if you're buying a decent font family, it should have a complete if you're buying a font, it should have a complete character set. And this includes things like periods, punctuation, dashes, slashes, brackets, money signs, for example. Math symbols. This is not a font that's used for math, but I wanted to design some math characters because people might use them. I also really love the arrows. Those are my favorite elements to design, as well as the paragraph and section markers. I think those are unique glyphs that are underused in fonts, but I like to add them in there for personality. Now there's another element of taking the character set that you have and making it more accessible to the world, and this involves designing an extended character set for the Latin language, the entire Latin extended alphabet. And this includes these characters here, which are have many different names, but the elements on the top are called diacritics, and these are what makes a Latin alphabet, English, American English, or British English Latin alphabet, and turns it into a Latin extended alphabet that can be used throughout Europe, some parts of South America, some parts of Africa, many things. But when you're designing diacritics, or when you were designing diacritics, what's unique about the font design program is you can create them as separate components. So you're not designing the A with the diacritic on top. You have right here on the bottom just the diacritic. This is the acute. So just the acute is designed. And then we've already designed the A. And so we use these as components, and we set anchors on, like, for example, the N here, the top and the bottom, and those anchors I set or you would set. And then the diacritics also have a complementary anchor to each of those points, so it knows how to line up the diacritic to the point on the letter that it's being added to. And so this allows us to automatically generate a lot of the extended alphabet characters. However, I want to note, if you're buying a good font, or if you're a type designer and you really want to think about the little things in your font, there are minute changes to the diacritics when they're applied to a lowercase character than they are when they're on a capital character. For example, the lowercase a here, or the capital A is fairly tall, and is not much shorter than the ascenders. So there's ascenders, yeah. So there's a very short space at the top. So this means the acute gets a little bit flattened and slightly scaled down, only very slightly, just to maintain the contrast there. And then on the lowercase a right next to it, you can see the acute is more upright, and it appears to have a little bit bigger size because it has a lot more white space above it. So it's to balance out that contrast again. And so you can look through all the different diacritics, and there are very minute scaling differences, very minute turning difference, rotation differences that makes the Latin extended alphabet have such variety but still maintain its consistency. Another aspect of designing a font is the number sets, and often people forget that there are two different numbers styles to design, and then there are, for each of those two different styles, there are two different spacings to set. So first we start with I started with the lining characters, which of course the top and the bottom line up across. And then I designed the old style figures, which down here below, you can see some dip below, like the 3, 4, 5, and then the 8, 7, or the 6 and the 8 go above the baseline. And just to emulate the old style letter forms that we've been seeing over history. And then for each of the lining figures here on the top and the old style figures on the bottom, there's two different spacing options to set. The proportional width spacing is more akin to kerning, for example, where the space between them is relative, depending on what the character shape is. But then the tabular width below, and then below on the old style as well, you can tell they're all a little bit spacier, and this is because they all share the same width. They're tabular, so they all have the exact same tab amount. And here is an example of what that looks like. It's mainly used for large spreadsheets, number documents, and this allows your vertical columns of your numbers to align and maintain their a little bit of legibility and readability on complicated documents at times. One of my favorite part of designing fonts too is adding additional characters like the ligatures. This font doesn't have too many ligatures. This is a sample. I think this is most of them, if not all of them. But for future fonts too, I'm thinking about letters as they're being used in context. So I've done some research and have looked up what the most frequent Latin characters are, what the most frequent digraphs and trigraphs are, which are 2-letter pairings or 3-letter pairings, and then also what the most frequent double letters are. And knowing this, it's a good starting point for designing ligatures, because as the designer I know, TH is going to come up very frequently in a text. So why not design a TH ligature that helps adjust the space and makes the text read more seamlessly. And yeah, so that's building the entire character set. Once the whole character set is made, we go into the spacing and kerning aspect of font design. And this is the most time-consuming part of the process, and I'll explain that a little later why. But there's essentially two processes to do in the spacing part. And they have two things to be done and have similar processes. So first is to determine the side bearing spacing of your letters. And that's shown on the left here. So on every single letter when it's designed, there's the final glyph form, and there's a little bit of space on the left and right side bearings of that letter. And you can see the A has a little bit, the O has a little bit, and this is the default metric spacing for the font. The next level of spacing that's put on top of that is kerning. And so I built kerning into this font. Any font you buy should have kerning designed into it. And this is where I go through some tests. I'll show you the process after. But essentially, I adjust the space between certain characters that share certain characters that happen or certain shapes that occur between each other, and I adjust the spacing accordingly. So essentially, I'm telling the computer, hey, font program, anytime I see a diagonal letter up next to a curved letter, kern it in a little bit, because I told the computer program there's too much space there, so pull it in a little bit. So kerning is the process of setting those values to make the optical appearance of the font look balanced when it's all typed out. Your font should look good with just metric side bearing spacing on, but kerning is always an essential part of any good design process. As far as doing both the metric spacing and the optical kerning, there's a standard string or standard script that's used across the type design industry. And so in general, you start with the uppercase spacing, then you go to the lowercase spacing, then to the diacritic, punctuation, and symbols. And so when doing just the letters, let's focus just on the uppercase. I only started by setting the side bearings of the H and the O. So those are the only, I first start with just those two characters, and I add a little bit of space on each side. Those are the side bearings. And then I'll type a bunch of H and O's out, a bunch of H's and O's out, vertically and horizontally, and I'll adjust the side bearings of the H and the O until the HO text that I just wrote looks to have an even grayness or even texture between all the H and O letters. And then, after the H and the O side bearings are set, I add another character. So the next character I added is an A, for example. So then I typed out HHA, HHA, a string that repeated with the A interchanging with H's and O's, and I set the side bearings of the A in relation to the O and the H, so that the A looked, whenever an A is put in that string of text, it looks like it has that even tone of color, that even texture across the text. And so this is repeated for every single character, from O, A, V, W, X, Y, T, J. It goes on. And there's a similar string order in a lowercase, starting with the N instead of the H, and doing the N and the O as your base characters for setting the spacing. Punctuation is a little bit different and would take a lot of time to explain. So I'm just going to move on to what can speed up this process is thinking of the spacing in terms of letter groups. Is similar to how when we were digitizing the letters, we were thinking them in letter groups like vertical, curve, diagonal. You also want to be thinking of this for kerning and for spacing side bearings and for doing the kerning as well. And so here, for example, are all the lowercase, minuscule curve shapes. And so after I've already set the side bearings, for example, on the O and the N and the H and the O, I can look at what other characters I've designed that don't have spacing yet, and I can see if any of those characters' shapes are similar to the O, the N, or the H, or the O, and then I can use that same spacing value on the character. So for example, the left side of the C shares a very similar shape to the O, so I know I can set the spacing of the C to be the same as the spacing of the O. And this helps speed up the process a lot because you can relate different characters' spacing to one another. And again, this is repeated for both the side bearings and the kerning. So like I said, you go through one character at a time, set the side bearing, and then I'll print out a bunch of test documents, look at how the texture of it looks and how it feels when I'm reading it, and then I'll go back through and try to space the font to make it look even better by kerning those unique characters that are seen extra far apart. So often like the capital A and the capital V are very far apart characters, so those always have to be kerned in. And so there are numbers that are generally problem pairs to look out for, but in general that process is the same when you're doing this. The process for setting the spacing of the font is the same for when you're doing side bearings, or similar when you're doing side bearings, and the process is similar when you're doing the kerning, when you're setting the kerning for the font. After all of that is done, especially the kerning, even after spacing, I'll do this, it's best to test the font. Put it into some actual designs and see how the font functions in real cases. This is a standard script that I've borrowed from, oh, I forget the type foundry. I have a book from them. Early 20th century type foundry in America. I think they're in New York. But they use this script of decreased sizes over the two columns. So it starts at, I think it's 80 point on the top left, then it goes all the way to an 8.5 on the right. And printing this out in real words gets me to see, how does the spacing look between the characters? Are there more problem pairs between the kerning that I need to adjust? And it also gives me a sense of how small this font can be seen and still be readable and still be recognized for words. So I'm going to say 14 point is probably the smallest I would set it. 12 point font, right? This is 12 point font, Remarkable Midnight Scenes Discovered or something. That's in 12 point, and you can see it's starting to degrade the quality. This is because it's a PDF, but when we zoom in, it looks nice, but if that was printed, it would lose quality, certainly. And again, trying out the font, testing it, putting it in, here's a spacing test string from Emily Reuter. She was a fantastic type designer at the end of the 20th century, and this was made in 1967, a string that she used in all of her fonts too. It's just a standard script that she would look at. It contained a bunch of different pairs that were common and unique pairs that often required additional kerning, so she would use this and recognize those problems pretty quickly because it was a bit of a repeatable process. I personally also like to do a technique that I learned in drawing school in high school, and that's to invert your drawing. Both the text, invert it black and white to white on black, and also invert the letters upside down, or if it's printed out, just turn the paper upside down. Seeing any form upside down, especially when you've been looking at it for hundreds of hours, it really forces your mind to look at that space in a new way, and I often almost always find more problem pairs, more letter pairs that need to be kerned or have additional spacing, for example. So this is a tactic that I like to use. And after I really get comfortable with the font is when I start thinking about exporting it to an actual font file and sending it off to designers to have marketing samples made. These are some marketing samples that I've created, but if you purchase the font or want to make some samples, I'd love to see you using this font in real life. Use the hashtag Concourse Font, hashtag Concourse Font, and I'll see your images. Here is a sample of a headline for a newspaper. I really designed this font to be a display font because it was seen as a big display sign above a terminal window or below a train terminal window, so I saw this as a heading font. Here's a quick pangram to show you what it could look like as a pull quote. Here are two posters that I created. This one on the left only uses concourse, so it uses size to create contrast in the design. So the good form is larger, and then a contemporary take on historical letter forms, yada, is smaller. And this O that you see on the background is actually the old style 0 form from Concourse Font. And then I just used a little pen tool to add some modern gradient to make it feel futuristic. On the right here is Concourse being used with a sans serif pairing. And so this gives you an example of how Concourse could be used with other fonts as a big heading for a movie title, and then using some chunky sans serif to complement the boldness of Concourse, and then using some thin sans serifs or some really light sans serifs down here to add contrast to that title and subtitle. And so this is, I think, a good use case for a Concourse that I've created. Since it's also a good display font, it's a great display font, so it could be used for, I see it being used in branding possibly, maybe some packaging where there's just single words on a box, or maybe a couple words, or a single logo word or logo word mark maybe. But it has such a bold personality and sharpness to it that I'd like to see it used in, here's for example, a fake J. Crew ad that I made. I'd love to see it being used in these kind of applications. And again, so check out my website, joeygrable.com, or email me directly at hello@joeygrable.com. I'm more than glad to answer any questions you have about the font. If you have troubles installing, I have resources on that. If you want to just learn more about type design, hit me up, and I'll be around YouTube, Instagram, and LinkedIn at Joey Grable 94. So find me on social media. Just want to thank you again for watching this video, and thank you especially to the Society for Calligraphy and Handwriting up in the Pacific Northwest, as well as the Write On Calligraphers Guild up in Bellevue, Washington, across from Seattle. They've been really supportive of my work over time, and they've allowed me to present this to their group. And so they gave me permission to post this to my YouTube channel to share with the rest of the world. So it was a great experience to present to them. I thank them for the opportunity, and I hope that the rest of the world learns something from watching my type design process. Again, I'm Joey Grable. Thank you very much for watching.